Is there such a thing as a picture-perfect home? We'd like to think so.
Reality shows us that there's nothing like a picture-perfect home. In our homes, there are closets we don't let anyone near, because we know what skeletons are in those closets.
We hope the ideal home exists, but we struggle to find it.
We look for young families,
Older families,
multi-generational families.
Christian families who can present themselves as picture-perfect.
We look for famous authors who write about those picture-perfect homes. But spend some time in their homes, and you will see that no family is perfect.
There are moments of rebellion.
Frustration, anger, and so on.
Each one results in some chinks in the armor of those supposed picture-perfect homes. We all need to learn how to navigate life, even when it's not picture-perfect.
If there ever was a place to look for a picture-perfect home, I think it'd be in the Bible, wouldn't you? And yet we look in the Bible at all the families, every one of them that I know of, had some kind of form of dysfunction in them. And so we can't look at the Bible. We look sometimes to television, but that doesn't seem to really be a good barometer at all, because all families have flaws and breakdowns. And here's the reason why. Because families are made up of people. That means you. And you're not perfect. I don't know if anybody's had the courage enough to tell you that or not, but you're not perfect. And if I dug enough and looked enough at your homes, I would find things that were flawed, okay? And you wouldn't have to find, don't shake your head at me like no. You know better than that. But if you looked at my home, you would see there are some flaws and some imperfections as well. And the reason why picture perfect really doesn't describe homes today is because families are partly made up of people and dogs and a cat. But if you have a cat and you love cats, don't get mad at me. I don't love cats at all. So nothing could be picture perfect about a cat in a home in my eyes. So we don't have cats at all. So what we've been saying over the last 4 or 5 weeks in this series is that we don't aspire to live picture-perfect lives. Instead, we just aspire to live better today than we did yesterday. Just to live a little better. And to continue on that growth continuum in our lives till we quit living here at all. One thing that has to be a thought is that we have to prepare for a crisis in our family. And here's what we've had happen to us in the world of church world here in the last 20, 30 years is we've been duped into believing that if we do things right spiritually, we will never have any problems. And I'll get to that in just a second. But often people look at our spiritual lives as an insurance policy that covers even crisis in the home. We want to avoid a crisis. And yet when we look at Jesus and his ministry, we see that he ran up against all kinds of crises. Poverty, illness, spiritual sickness, family problems, financial problems, group dynamic problems. I mean, if you were to take the apostles and say they were a family, they had more problems than most families did, getting along with each other. And those issues that we just listed off that Jesus has encountered are born out of ignorance, or they're accidental, or they're intentional. One of those three things. And it happens to all of us. Everyone will have a crisis. For me, it started years and years ago with this couple by the name of Kim and Wayne, who decided to get married. And 25 years ago, I married them. And had a nice ceremony. Everything was great about it. Their lives went on. And you know what? When you started to look at their lives from outside looking in, you thought, man, they're perfect. I mean, they're just perfect for each other. And they got 3 kids, and they're all perfect. And they're all pretty much stair steps down, and everything's going right for them all the time. And so you might look at Wayne and Kim and say, they have a picture-perfect life, but they didn't. There were flaws in their lives as well. And then there were things that happened that were not intentional at all. One Saturday morning, after their children had had a sleepover with a bunch of kids, especially the boys who were in junior high and early high school at the time, one Saturday morning, the boys were upstairs playing in the house, And upstairs there was a pool table and a television and stuff like that. And they were going at it like boys do and everything. And there was a moment. There was a moment when one boy had a pool stick, and what he did was he accidentally pulled it back like that and poked one of Wayne and Kim's son's eye. Terrible, terrible injury for them. They spent weeks, even months, trying to get over the first wave of difficulty in their life. But all of a sudden, their life was now defined by before the accident and after the accident. Before and after. And that family navigated this crisis so well, and yet it was so hard. Their son spent several weeks in the hospital down here in Oklahoma City at Baptist, and the family navigated it. And as a family, they remained intact and they flourished. It took them well over a couple years to get back to some semblance of normal, and eventually they did, but it was hard. And all of a sudden, their life was not just about picture perfect anymore. It was about trying to figure out how to live better, because their poor young son was dealing with potential blindness, maybe even not having the eye, all kinds of stuff. All out of one Saturday morning, in one moment, something happened. And yet, what did they do? Well, they were a kind of a picture of somebody who learned to navigate crisis. And that's what I want to talk to you about this morning. I think this could be the most important sermon in this series. I really do, for all of us. Because all of us go through times of crisis. We don't know where it's going to hit or where it's going to come from. We don't know if it's going to be something that we see coming or if it comes right out of the blue like it was for Kim and Wayne. We don't know any of those things. But when it happens, we've got to learn how to deal with it. And so I hope this morning you'll listen carefully to what I've got to say, because you may not be in a crisis now, but chances are you're going to be in one sometime. And you may be right in the middle of a crisis now and barely hanging on. And that's fine. That's okay. This sermon will help you as well. So we've got some principles of crisis navigation. The first one is that we need to make this mental assent to this and say that crisis is a reality. Crisis is a reality in this life. Now, it's hard when you're thinking about that, and it's kind of startling, because so many people, especially in the church, assume if they do everything right, they will be able to avoid a crisis. People say, I never thought we'd have this kind of trouble. Or I thought if I believed in God, He would protect us against these kinds of troubles. Or maybe if I was more faithful to God, He would protect me from a crisis. And yet everybody's got crisis. Everyone does. It doesn't work that way because we live in a broken world. We have to constantly, continually remind ourselves in this that this place is not our home, as the old song says. We're just a passing through. And there is another home for us, and that would be heaven in the presence of Jesus and God. And as long as we live on this earth, we are living in a broken world. And let's be honest, it is really broken. I mean, we're not just minimizing this at all. It is broken. Everywhere you turn, it's broken. And with that brokenness comes hardship and sorrow and injury and more. Now, Jesus stated this clearly in His ministry in John 16, verse 33. I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble. I want you to read that with me out loud. In this world you will have trouble. But take heart, I have overcome the world. Now you can listen to all kinds of people that are experts about life who will say to you, if you do the right things, you'll never have any troubles. Or you can listen to Jesus. And I would highly recommend Jesus. Because if you don't listen to Jesus and you buy the goods that a lot of people sell in our country today, and I use that word purposely, sell, because it usually is the case. If you don't buy Jesus' words but buy their words, you're still going to have trouble. Take it from me. You're going to have trouble. And it was true of people in the Bible. For instance, we hold up Moses as one of the greatest men that ever lived. We think about how he navigated so many things when he was younger, and then when he was an adult, navigating more things, and eventually began to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. And you would think that that story would kind of end at the end of out of Egypt, but it didn't. You know from Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy and all those books in the front of the Bible that Moses actually got to the place where he just looked at God and he said, these people are so corrupt and so bad, just kill me. Just kill me and take my life now. And of course, he didn't, because Moses still had things that needed to be done. And he didn't get a pass because of all the great things he did at all. Joseph didn't get a pass because of all the great things he did. David didn't get a pass because of all the great things that he did. And when I say accidental or intentional, as I said earlier, in a lot of ways, David's trials and tribulations were not accidental, they were intentional. And it ended up wrecking his family. You can go back and read that in 1st, 2nd Samuel. You get the story there. Or I think about Job. Job, good old Job. Satan comes to God and says, you know what, if you would remove your protection from him, he would curse you and run you down. And God said, really? I don't think so. And sure enough, Job lost his wife, or lost his kids, lost his cattle, lost everything that he had in his life. Crisis after crisis after crisis, Job had that. And yet, he was not immune from all of those crises because the Bible says that he was a righteous man. Righteous man, yes, he was, very righteous. Jesus says, in this world, you will have what? Now, you don't act like you believe that. If I were to have an open mic and put it right here and have you guys line up and pray and just tell us what was a crisis that you've had in your life, we wouldn't get out of here till tonight. We just go from now until 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. and come to worship night. Maybe that would be a good thing. Everybody has crisis. You all have a story. And I have a story. And it involves, in some way or another, a potential or a real crisis in your life. And so you may be facing diagnosis like cancer or other ailments like heart disease. You may have dealt with miscarriage or the death of a child or unemployment or betrayal or accidents. That's the reality. That's what happens in a broken world. So we want to make this really clear up front. You do not avoid a crisis, you navigate them. You do not avoid crisis, you have to learn how to navigate them in your life. That's why I'm such a huge fan of Daniel in the Old Testament. And a couple of things that stand out even in the first chapter, and it carries all the way through the book. But I'm just so amazed at Daniel. You know, Daniel was minding his own business, doing what he was supposed to do, being God's man in Jerusalem. When the Babylonians showed up, they carted a bunch of them back to Babylon, left a little bit of a remnant in Jerusalem. And Daniel and his 3 buddies, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were part of that group that got taken back to Babylon. And their life was turned completely upside down. Completely. And he was confronted with things that would cause him to have to choose between God and the Babylonians. And if you got a Bible, you might read this with me in verse 3. The screen will pick up in verse 5. But then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his court officials, chapter 1, verse 3, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and nobility, young men, now listen to this, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. So what was happening here was that the king, Nebuchadnezzar, ordered that some guys be brought into the court, and they were to be completely rerouted in terms of their life and how they think. He was going to take 3 years and cause them to learn, or cause Daniel and the guys to learn how to think and to live like a Babylonian. That was the deal. And he wanted those guys to serve in his court. Well, Daniel, pretty interesting. Verse 5 says, the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table, and they were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter into the king's service. But Daniel, in verse 8, it says, Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now, God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned you food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other men in your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Daniel was cautious in his requests. And if you read the rest of the chapter 1, and then even the rest of the book, you're going to see an amazing ability to navigate one crisis after the other. Into the lion's den, into the court of the officials. There's all kinds of things that happen in this book. And what it shows more than anything in my mind is that you navigate crisis, you don't just avoid them at all. And yet, we are really into crisis avoidance. We'll do anything to avoid a crisis if we can. But that gets us in trouble because we can't. Crises are still going to come. So one of the other principles that we want to talk about is that you prepare for a crisis before it hits. You prepare for a crisis before it hits. Now think about some crisis in your life. Some crisis that it was a surprise. How did you feel about that? Did you feel like you were being overrun and things were happening that you thought, man, I have no control over this. All I can do is lay it before God and try to do the best that I can. That may be true, but there's some other things you can do to prepare for a crisis. And we all ought to be in the line to preparing for crisis because it happens. I told the football team this the other night, and I thought it was a good illustration of preparing. A few years ago, I surprised Pam for her 50th birthday and flew to Aspen, Colorado, where she was up doing some camping, and I camped with them a couple days. But it was her birthday, and actually I showed up on the day that they were going to do whitewater rafting down the Colorado River. And I thought, oh, that'd be cool. I think I'd like to do that. And then I started looking at that river. And it had been a wet spring and early summer, and the water was flowing so fast, so much white water going on, that it made me kind of nervous. And I don't get nervous around water. I've been pretty adept over the years in being able to deal with water, but this kind of scared me a little bit. And so we got in the boat, and we had our life jackets on, and we were going to do this, and I'm kind of just a little bit jittery. And then our guide jumped in the boat. And I swear he looked like he was 14. I mean, I really do. He looked so 14 to me that I was about ready to get out of the boat and take my chances walking down or doing something different. But I asked him a question before I got out of the boat. I just looked him right in the eye, and he's sitting there, and he's just ready to go and everything. And I said, how many times have you been down this river? And he shot back at me right almost immediately. More times than I can count. You know what? I stayed in the boat. I thought, man, his answer was so right for that circumstance. It was more times than he could count. He was ready for anything, and he was. He was ready for the whitewater. He'd been down the river several times right before that, and he was ready for boulders who get underneath the boat and knock you out and all kinds of things like that. He was totally prepared for anything that might come along. So let me ask you today, just be really honest here. I'm going to be kind of transparent a little bit, but I just want to start with a question. Are you prepared for anything that comes along? Are you prepared? I mean, do you really think that you could deal with a crisis and navigate it where you're at spiritually right now? You should be that way. Definitely should be that way. And I think all of us in preparation need to make sure that we are creating margin in our life. Now, we talk about margin in terms of financial margin and, in terms of time margin. We've talked about that a lot. But this isn't financial or time. This is margin in all of our lives that causes us to think about whether or not we're prepared for a crisis. I've been really trying to help my parents with this. As well as they have lived their life, and they've done so many really awesome things to set up the later part of their years, There are a couple things they just pretty much refuse to acknowledge. And I keep telling them, we want to decide these things when there's not a crisis. Let's decide it now when we're not in total crisis. And I don't know if it's ever going to happen or not. I would love to believe it would. I would love to believe I have the powers of that kind of persuasion, which I'm finding out I don't. And that's okay, but you got to prepare for it ahead of time. Are you prepared? Are you prepared for a downturn in the economy? That's a financial thing. Are you prepared for the death of somebody in your family? And it can happen very fast, can't it? Some of you know that. Joel knows that with the death of his father-in-law. That was so sudden. And, when it happens, then all of a sudden you've got to be either prepared or you're going to get run over by it, one or the other. Are you prepared to deal with relationship snafus that come along and cause you to have to humble yourself in a relationship with somebody else? This is where Daniel excelled. His spiritual well was deep. It was very deep. And so I would challenge you to think in terms of this picture. You and I need to make sure that we dig our wells deep. We need to picture this, and we need to be the kind of people that dig and dig and dig in the good times so that in the bad times we can draw and draw and draw. Now, this is great for people of young age like you all. It's for the rest of us, it's great too, because every day that it's not a crisis should be a day that you are digging your spiritual well deep and deeper and deeper. And I'll talk about what that looks like here in just a second. That's what Kim and Wayne had done for years. And so when they came up from this situation with their son, they had so much to draw from, especially spiritually with God. They trusted God. And they said, whatever happens, it's going to happen. I don't know what God's got in his hand in this, but I believe that, and they believed it. And it's pretty amazing to see. They had deep wells of faith. They were prepared during a crisis to not dig, but to draw. That's what you do when you go to a well and you're running out of water. You're going to draw deeper and deeper and deeper. Hopefully your well has been dug deep enough that you can hit water every time. But some people think, well, I won't worry about a crisis until it hits. And let me say to you, you're in a heap of trouble if you do that. Because there are times when stuff hits us in our life and we don't have the energy to draw or to dig anymore. All we want to do is draw. Dig your wells deep. In a crisis, if you're in the middle of a crisis, and you take this from my own life as well as many others, in a crisis, you don't dig a deeper well. You're trying to survive. And so in a crisis, you're drawing from the well. And before that crisis ever happens, you need to dig a well really deep. And so if times are good in your life right now, this means you should be drawing or digging deeper and deeper wells, because there are going to be times when it isn't going to work. If you've had a crisis this week, would you have the spiritual well deep enough to allow you to navigate that crisis? Now, I'm being stone cold here for you. Much of the church doesn't know anything about digging deeper wells. And they hope they can scoot by. I'm talking about the church in general, that they can scoot by, get past the crisis, and somehow survive. There's a better way to do this. You can navigate the crisis, whatever it is, and you would do that with a deeper and deeper well. The other thing that you can do is engage with other people. Engage with other people. What I love about Daniel is that hardly anything that Daniel does in the book called Daniel, he does alone. I mean, he's got people around him that believe the same way he does. And even though he's the leader and out front, he's got a lot of relationships. He engages with other people. But let me say this to you, and I've seen this 100 times, if not 1,000, that when people go through crisis in their life, their first reaction is to isolate. To isolate. And in so doing, they play right into the devil's hands. I've had a situation over the years where I was in a crisis for a while. And it was not anything to do with me personally, but it was to do with people that I love. And one of the things that I did when this first popped up is I decided I was not going to tell anybody about the crisis, period. And for 3 years, I didn't. Only Pam and I knew what we were dealing with. What a terrible, terrible mistake I made. And I've talked to my kids, and I've talked to Pam, and I've said, I just made a mistake there. I just thought we could handle it on our own, and we couldn't at all. And so after 3 years, we kind of started telling key people. And it was amazing. You know, I often remember thinking, where were you guys when I needed you? And then I thought, oh yeah, you were right there at the door, but I wouldn't let you in. Because that's really the natural inclination when you go into a crisis. Isolate. The devil, that is his plan for dealing with crisis, and he'll do his best to convince you to go it alone. And so right now, if you're not in a crisis, this is a great time to decide, to make the decision that if we get in a crisis, we are going to have some people around us that are going to help us with this. People that we love, people that care about us. And if we don't do that, then we're going to be in trouble. Now, that can be anything from some neighborhood group that you're a part of. Certainly, the church ought to be a part of that. And that's why we say you ought to be involved in some groups and classes and stuff like that, where it kind of breaks down a little bit, because you're going to be in a crisis. And when you're in a crisis, you're going to want to turn to somebody. And I think the best people to turn to are the people that love Jesus just like you do. The Bible says in 1 Thessalonians 5:11, encourage one another and build each other up. And that's great truth. But if you decide never to tell anybody what kind of crisis you're going through, and if you decide to shoulder it on your own and to walk through that, don't blame the church for not being there to encourage you. Don't do it. Instead, we ought to be just the other way about this, that when we come into these kind of crises, we call on people to help us to walk through them, to engage with other people. Galatians chapter 6, verse 2 says, carry each other's burdens. You can't carry burdens or you can't have people carry your burden if they don't know what your burden is. Like I said last week, and it's true for this message as well, all of us need each of us. Amen? All of us need each of us, and that's what this family is about. And then the third thing that you should do, dig your wells deep, engage with other people, and then turn to Jesus. And you know what I've learned about Jesus over the years? He makes some of the best promises. He really does. I mean, he makes us offers that we can't refuse. Like, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Man, that's a jewel right there. Come to me. And I had that part down in my life when we were going through this crisis. I mean, I prayed long and hard and wrote a lot, read a lot. I tried everything. And I had a lot in my well to dwell from, but it was still really hard to draw from. It was still really hard. Come to me, all you who are weary. Anybody in here weary? Or burdened? Anybody in here burdened? Jesus says the first person you ought to turn to is me. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest. I don't know how many times I've leaned on that verse in my life. Hundreds of times. Just recently I read that verse. And I told God, your son Jesus made this promise, and I need him to come through. All I need to know is he going to be there when I'm so weary and burdened? And that he'll give me rest. Jesus said to his disciples, peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid. Don't be afraid. I've got a friend that's really going through a big giant crisis in his life right now. And these are words that are so appropriate for him. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid. God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. So we say with confidence, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me? Aren't those powerful words? And you may be right in the middle of a crisis, and these may be words that drop deep into your soul, and that's great. Or you may not be in a crisis, and you're trying to figure out what's this sermon going to be for me. All he can say is there's probably, in all probability, there's a crisis waiting around the corner for you. And wouldn't it be great that maybe you've never thought about digging spiritual wells before? But wouldn't it be great if you were in this time in your life where you actually started digging spiritual wells? You actually started reading the Bible for its part of your life. You've actually started praying to God, even when you don't know what to pray. There have been times in your life where you're thinking, I'm so far from God that God wouldn't even know what to do with me. Accept the good news here. You are not too far from God at all. God's Spirit is there, as we talked about earlier this year, as a helper. The Holy Spirit is your helper. He's your advocate and he's your comforter, but I love the words, he's a helper. And he's there for you. And you know that he will be there for you, no matter what happens in your life. Now, it's kind of a little bit of a dark sermon in some ways. And I thought about that this week and thought, it's kind of dark. But I want to try to bring some light to this, okay? Wayne and Kim, multiple surgeries on their boy's eye. They didn't think he'd ever be able to see out of it. He sees a little bit out of it now. It's been years later. The cool thing is that he's off to OSU this year and starting college and doing really well. All their family's doing really well. And I remember going to their house and sitting down in their living room, and I said, you know what I saw these last couple years with you? And they said, what? I see a family that's got really deep wells of faith. And you drew and you drew and you drew. And as things have leveled out, I've seen you going to digging and digging and digging some more. And I'll never forget what Wayne told me. He said, well, we can't expect that there won't be more crisis, right? I said, yeah, you're selling yourself down the river if you think you'll never have another crisis. You will. So dig your wells deep. When you walk into my office to talk to me, that phrase confronts you right as you walk in. It's right on my wall. Big old piece of wall hanging that says, dig your wells deep. And you think it's a reminder to you coming into my office. You know, really, it's not a reminder to you. It's a reminder to me. Got to continue to dig my wells deep. Because there are crises that happen in life. Because why? Because we live in a broken world. You're never going to escape this world without some kind of crisis, I don't think. And if you will lean into Jesus, if you'll turn to Jesus, Jesus says he'll be there for you as well. Now, for some of you, your faith is so rock solid and great that this kind of, it doesn't really go over your head, but it processes and you think, yeah, I'm doing good. But I'm thinking about the people, and I know there's people in here who are far from God and who have kind of bought the goods that are being sold out there that you don't have to worry about a crisis because you're living the right life. No, you do need to worry. Everybody needs to be concerned about crisis that comes along. And they need to dig their wells deep, and then they need to draw and draw and draw. If you're far from God today, you could take a step here and just say, I want to be closer to God. I want God to be a part of my life personally. Not just showing up in church once a week, but personally in your life, saying, I don't like where my life's going. I don't know where it's headed. And I can see there's going to be potential crisis down the road, and I want to get right with God so I can start digging a well. You know what? That'd be the best thing you could decide today. And I hope you'll think about that in your life as well. Why don't you stand if you would? We're going to sing a song, and this is an invitation. You can come forward. You can come to talk to me, have a short conversation that will lead to a longer conversation. That's fine. Or if you want to join the church, you can do that. Come right up here in front, and we'll take care of that. But I just wonder if some of you don't need a shovel in your hand so you can just start digging. And why do I say that? Because I don't think anybody has the right to put their faith and their life on cruise control. I think you dig or you draw. You dig or you draw. You dig, and then you draw. That's how it works. And I hope that's part of your life. And that you've made commitments in your life to do that. And if you haven't, drive a stake today. Say, this is the day that I start a new life where I'm going to dig and I'm going to draw. Father, we thank you so much for the truth that comes out of your word, especially from the person of Daniel, as much as anybody. It seemed like every time he got himself in a major crisis, he was so close to you, and he had dug so deeply his spiritual wells of faith that he had plenty to draw on. God, I pray that today no one would leave this room without thinking so seriously about where they're at with you and what's their well look like. If there's no well, start today. That's what you would say. If there's a well that's not very deep, till there's crisis, you go for it. Deep digging. Spiritual wells of faith. Help us to remember this phrase, this dig your wells deep, and to do right by it as we put our faith and trust in Jesus. Pray this in his name.